Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from the OECD's Pillar 2 to macroeconomics and geopolitics. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Check out PwC Policy on Demand news platform that provides in-depth insights and analysis on tax policy developments. Policy on Demand is now available for free at policyondemand.pwc.com. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're recording in front of a live studio audience from PwC's International Tax Conference in Dana Point, California, where I'm excited to be joined by Craig Stonberg. Craig is the Senior Director of PwC Intelligence, spearheading a team of analysts helping global businesses with geopolitical risk, macroeconomic volatility, and supply chain shifts. Craig, welcome to the podcast. It's nice to have you back on.
Thank you.
So last time you were on this podcast, we were deep in the throes of the pandemic, lockdown. I was forced to do my podcast via video, and I don't miss those times. But before we dive into the current geopolitical and macroeconomic environment, any big takeaways from the US lockdown and the global approach to COVID?
So the first big takeaway that I had when I came here is that during the lockdown, your beard got salt and pepper and mine was all salt.
Yeah, so for those that are listening to this, you've got a strong goatee game, I will just comment.
Yes, but it was stressful, right?
It was.
I think this is part of the lesson for us, is that it is very difficult for us to separate the personal and human part of COVID from the business part of COVID. So COVID was, and as we've talked about in the past, right? Before I was a consultant, I was an intelligence officer, and right before I was an intelligence officer, I was a historian. COVID was the historical equivalent of a meteor strike. The ramifications of all that happened during COVID are not done with us, right? We are doing our best to get past it, right? We're here in person. It's awesome.
It's fantastic.
Incidence, sickness is going down, and all that is wonderful. But the macroeconomic and geopolitical ramifications of COVID are not done. If you look back at what happened from 1918, to 1920 at the influenza, the 20s and 30s were shaped by that epidemic. And we should have every expectation that the operating environment for companies throughout the 2020s that remain well into the 2030s could be shaped by what happens and how companies react to them as well as governance. I think part of what we have to take away from COVID is that we have to stop using the word never. Like there have been, I'm not gonna make any assumptions about anybody in the audience's age but mine, but even in my lifetime, right, there have been at least 4 things that had somebody told you or I the quarter before they happened, they would have happened. We would have said they were never gonna happen. They were impossible, right? The fall of apartheid and the placement of Mandela as the leader of the new South Africa, the fall of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was a remarkable trifecta that nobody saw coming, 9/11, and a global pandemic in which nobody cooperated with one another. And this is one of the other things that is shaping actively every day as we speak the operating environment, is that COVID should have been an opportunity for the countries of the world to come together and solve a transnational problem that affected all of them equally, and they didn't. Before COVID, if you think about the geopolitical systems as guardrails, on one of the sides of these beautiful roads here in California, right? It was rusted and weak. COVID completely removed the guardrails. And so the environment right now is that the geopolitical shifting sands are not well-founded. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of power shifts that are happening. And COVID was the ignition for all of that.
And we're still seeing the impacts of this, and particularly with many of us who have colleagues in China, and the fact that they appeared to be sort of a number of years ahead. It's hard to believe that was 3 years ago that we recorded that first podcast, and we'll come back to China a little bit in the podcast. But the theme of the podcast is disequilibrium. So let me start with the elephant in the room here that's relevant for all of our listeners and our guests is, have or are we reaching the end of globalization? This has been a constant theme and question over the last few years, and what's your take on that?
So I think it's one of the most important questions, I think, for any business in any sector, any industry, any country. And it's a question that I know I'm getting a lot, I know you're getting a lot. This is where I think the guidance on the use of the word never, I think, also comes in. You are hearing or seeing some headlines in the media that are saying, like, this is the end of globalization, right? We're done. I think that is premature. I think there are shifts that are happening in globalization, and one of the reasons why, connected to your first question, is that for a long time, trade, commerce, and all the policies surrounding it were driven by having macroeconomic policy and perspective in the front seat, and geopolitics was in the back seat. Because most of us can remember a world where geopolitically it was reasonable for a company to think that the next quarter was going to look a lot like this quarter. Yes, there would be crises. Yes, people would live, die, get elected, right? Small changes, but overall, it was going to be about the same. Again, COVID completely changed that. If you think back on the last several quarters and all of the changes you see geopolitically and macroeconomically in every one, this is what disequilibrium means, right? Is that the operating environment is not predictable. I have to imagine that many companies, corporate leaders, right, are getting off the elevator and going into their suites down the hall and passing the pictures, right, of all their predecessors. And all they can say to those people is, you guys had it easy. Like, you led this company in a time where everything was predictable, and now it's not predictable.
Money was cheap.
And everything shifted, right? So COVID has loosened all of these forces, and it's creating this environment where predictability, which is so important for businesses, is at a premium.
So talk about, there's been a number of trade alliances, including the RCEP, the CPTPP, that's a mouthful. You can remind everybody what those stand for. But particularly in Asia, we're seeing kind of new alliances and really, these trade pacts that frankly the US had been historically very involved with. How is that kind of shifting things?
So what this is a good example of is that how one looks at globalization depends on where you are in the world, which for companies that are multinational companies, it means they cannot have a single view of globalization. So I think anybody would be excused to say that in the United States, globalization is under some pressure, be that economic pressure, policy pressure. We may talk about a couple of those things. But in many places in the world, especially South, East, Southeast Asia, there's a lot of regionalization / local globalization that's going on. And if you go back a couple of years, if you remember, we had signed with several other countries in the Pacific, principally also drafted by the Japanese, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we withdrew from that in 2017 before it came into force. What Japan really did was pick up the remnants of that and get those other countries together and say, we're going to carry this forward, right? And they did that with the CPTPP. RCEP's bigger. RCEP involves China, and because it involves China and the other countries in Asia and across Indonesia all the way down into the Oceania, it's got 30% of GDP represented. So there are places, particularly in that part of Asia, where you don't see this coming apart. They are looking to trade together, and as you look at long-term historic trends, and as we project these forward, deals activity, M&A activity, investment activity, FDI flows, that part of the world is increasingly going to get a lot of them, and these agreements are facilitating all of that.
So who else's decision-making is impacting the course of trade and globalization? And we've got a lot of US multinationals in the room and US listeners. And I think about CFIUS, which we talked about on our last podcast, additional export control, so particularly impacting US multinationals. But who are some of those key players in addition to Asia, which you just mentioned?
So part of the challenge, I think, for multinationals, whether they're American multinationals or not, is you look at world capitals. You pick your world capital, right? Nairobi, Brussels, Moscow, Beijing. As I look at it every day, the world capital that is the least predictable for multinationals is Washington. I mean, it is changing, it is often reactionary, and it is not retreating. Like, it is on the march when it comes to how they feel they should be enforcing trade and limiting what countries should get. Like, there is not active decoupling writ large going on between the US and China. But there is micro decoupling that is going on between the US and China when it comes to the US's technology sector, where the US itself is slowly decoupling parts of that sector from China. And this comes on top of, if you go back to 2017, 2018, a great strengthening by law, right, of the Committee on Foreign Investment for the US, CFIUS, which changes the way that foreign investment comes into the US. There is currently not an export equivalent of CFIUS. I would be shocked if in the next year we don't see action on something that comes like that, either from executive order or from an act of Congress. If I had to assess, I think the White House would probably prefer it was an act of law, because part of the reason that CFIUS has those powers that are affecting the market so much is because they're directed by law. They have real regulatory authority, and I think you're going to see the government much more interested in who is investing in certain non-market economies, what are they investing in, and I think one of the things that people forget about CFIUS is that CFIUS was given the power a few years ago to unwind deals. So deals that have happened years in the past, if they feel that they now threaten US national security in some way, or they expose massive amounts of US citizens' data in some way, they can force those two entities to undo the deal. I would assess that it is likely that those who would like there to be more export control would like a similar power. We don't know if they'll get it. But all of this gets to the point that I started with, which is Washington is probably going to continue to be a very unpredictable place where more regulatory authority about trade, what you can trade, who you can trade it with, is all going to be coming down the pike with real regulatory authority behind it, and the government watching really closely who's trading with who.
It's fascinating what you mentioned about sort of these export controls and sort of the outbound version of CFIUS. Are there particular industries that should keep an eye on this? Is this more kind of the tech sector, even potential pharma, life sciences?
So I think you got two of them, right? Tech is absolutely, I think, the one that should be thinking about this the most, and I think they are. Pharma, life sciences is another. Now, pharma, healthcare is kind of a dual-edged sword, right? Because on the one hand, the US has been willing to allow that sector to continue to export because it's humanitarian good, right? And the US doesn't want to necessarily limit any country's ability to advance the health of its people. But where those sectors converge with technology, I think you might see this. I think the other one to think about is the financial sector implications of this. Who facilitates the investment, right? And if companies are using partners or companies from the financial sector to invest in technologies in non-market economies, that entire investment chain, might be under scrutiny. And so I think there's going to be others. I think one of the things to keep in mind here is that right now, look, many companies struggle themselves to have perfect end-to-end visibility on their supply chain. Every component, every piece, it's a lot to ask of a company, right? Even a company that's been doing this for decades, it's a huge expense, and it's a data problem and all the rest of it, right?
And a lot of us have seen that from a tax perspective, so that resonates.
And it's extraordinarily challenging. It can take years to do. If the companies can't all do this, right, the government doesn't have the ability to do this either. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the government's point of view on this is often different than what a company's point of view on this. You know, and I speak on this as someone that spent 20 years in the US government, right? They think about national security first, and the way that they are informed is often not with information that the rest of us have access to. And it changes their point of view on what's imperative. And so they can often make decisions with information we don't know, and it can change the speed with which they react to things. So again, I know that companies want to get back to a place where they can get back to that point of equilibrium where its next quarter is going to be a lot like this quarter. But all of these reactions, like this is all the part of the COVID operating environment. And unfortunately, I think it's going to be this way for a while.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that from a tax perspective with the introduction of Pillar 2. Of course, I'd be remiss to have a cross-border tax talks and at least not drop a Pillar 2 reference even when I have a geopolitical expert on. But I think that's just a symptom of the larger issue.
But Pillar 2 is right. Pillar 2 should have been, and in some ways is, an exception to the impossible rule. Like in the current environment, there is an argument that could be made that this should not have been possible, right? That they should not have been able to come together and do this.
Agreed.
But they did.
They did.
And so but it's one of the few examples, right, which tells you that every government that is responsible, right, still sees tax policy as something they have to have front and center. Because if any issue can make it through the geopolitical gauntlet and reach agreement, it's going to be a lasting issue.
So where does China sit in the middle of this? And particularly, how do U.S. companies deal with the current tension from a geopolitical perspective with U.S. and China?
So, look, I think of the clients that I talk to the most globally and in the U.S. across sectors, most of the conversations for the last 2 years, in one way or another, have been about China. So I think we're lucky in that Xi Jinping and Joe Biden know one another better than any two world leaders know one another in the world stage today. Possibly, you'd have to go back to the 40s to find this kind of a relationship. They've known one another for the better part of 30 years, going back to when Joe Biden was a junior senator and Xi Jinping was a minor party functionary. There's even a rumored, and if anybody has this, I'll pay for it, videotape somewhere of a basketball game that took place somewhere between them in the 90s that I've never seen evidence of, but I have reason to believe it exists.
You can probably find it on YouTube.
I've looked.
All right.
I think one of those two people keeps hiding it, okay. Whoever lost. But the fact that these two know one another has a direct bearing on the answer to your question, because I think they came in to the new era a couple of years ago with an agreement that they will do their best to keep things on a low boil. Recent things that have happened in the near atmosphere, literally make that a little harder.
Right.
But even then, I think they're doing their best to keep things calm. However, a couple of things are happening in the background for companies that are going to make this harder. One of the things that's happening in China is that China has, for reasons of its own, this myriad labyrinth of data and cyber regulations. Because what happened in part was, if you think about China, Chinese technology companies advanced so quickly in the last 15, 20 years that by about 2012, they knew more about what was happening in China on a daily basis than the party did, which is not an acceptable condition for the party.
Right.
So the party started to develop regulations through which all companies need to be more transparent about their data. This means that any company operating in China, whether you're Chinese or Kenyan or Canadian or US, you have these huge data requirements. We are getting to the point that for some multinational companies, the cost of compliance is equating to revenue from the market. So they are beginning to have a significant degree of pessimism about staying in China. So they are asking the question, if not China, where? And I don't know if there's a real alternative. There is only one country that has the technology, infrastructure, funding requirements, all the rest of it, to do the type of operations and manufacturing you have in China, and that's the US. And they're simply not going to move a lot of that stuff back here. As they're looking to other places, which just so happen to be those countries that are affected by RCEP and CPTPP in Southeast Asia, the problem they're running into is, if you look at a country like Vietnam or Thailand, it's a fastly dynamic economy. The talent pool is remarkably small compared to China. And most of that talent is already spoken for. So you can't simply pick up and leave China. The problem at the other end, though, is that DC is increasingly saying, maybe it's time. You know, they're not having like the serious talk yet with industries, but they're starting to have informal talks to sort of get to the point that maybe we should start to rethink this. So I think the tension is going to be kept under wraps to the best of those two leaders' ability, but US pessimism about operating China is probably going to continue. Finding alternatives is going to be really hard. And I think part of where the intersection for companies and tax here is, at the end of the day, I don't know if a lot of companies are going to leave China because it's a regulatory system they understand. It's a tax system they understand. Whether they like it or not, another question.
A lot of chips on the table.
And they would be hesitant, right, to move those chips because they understand how they got there. And even if they need to keep putting them in, if you have to take them off and move them someplace else, it may be too much of a cost.
So let's move over to Europe. We're almost at 1 year, and by the time this is published, we'll be after the 1 year mark of the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Where are we headed in Europe, and what does it mean for multinationals?
So I think the good news for Europe is that, well, those of us, at least I hope many of you, like me, got a summer vacation last summer. Energy ministers in Europe did not get a vacation, right? They ran all over the world 7 days a week trying to find energy reserves. And what is remarkable is that it worked. Like, Europe is making its way through a, thankfully, not terribly cold winter with the reserves that it has and with the access that it has. They have been successful in avoiding what could have been a really dire situation, which is directly linked to the health of the economy in Europe. So things in Europe in terms of the economy, I think, are better than we expected. The problem is European companies and US companies look at Ukraine very differently, right? Especially speaking here from the West Coast, like, Ukraine is very far away, not just geographically, but ideologically, right? Unless you have a lot of people there or you had a lot of investments there, and many US companies didn't, it's not something that's top of mind for them. What I think is important for companies to think about this year, whether they had operations there or not, is that something happened with Ukraine which is pretty dynamic. I think you could use other words, which is that the G20, most of the G20 anyway, effectively took one of their own members and put them in exile from a large part of the global economy, which is pretty interesting. I think the other thing to think about, and this is the lasting impact, is that I think US citizens and US corporate officers would be excused in thinking that when the US asked for much of the rest of the world to stop trading with Russia, everybody said, you got it. But in fact, most of the world said no. Especially in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, they said no. And so the lingering impact for the US is going to be, how do we cobble together global entities to take on issues? I think as it concerns Ukraine and the conflict itself, I think the end game is going to be very complicated. I don't see either one of these parties wanting to go to the table and talk. I think it's going to be very difficult to get either one, much less both of them, to the table. And if you get them to the table, keeping them at the table is going to be really challenging. And so I fear that it will be a relatively messy and even more violent end to the conflict, and that people should not be thinking about this as something that ends this year. This could go on for a while.
So I want to follow up on the Russian sanctions point. Do you think that because of the U.S. policy vis-a-vis the policies, particularly in Asia and even in Europe, that U.S. multinationals have been disproportionately impacted by that, or was it just frankly the economy was relatively small, that there was less of an impact for U.S. MNCs? Any thoughts on that?
So they've been far less impacted than other, regional players. The Europeans in particular were far more heavily hit. A lot of US multinationals have been able to successfully shift both people and operations to other places, which has been a boon to places like Romania, Bulgaria, who have gotten a lot of this. I think one of the things for us to be thinking about, though, is that if things go poorly in Ukraine, you could see tens of millions, 25, 35 million Ukrainians headed west, which we haven't seen since World War II. The world is not prepared for the geopolitical and macroeconomic impact that would come if Ukraine starts to lose and the Ukrainian people cannot stay there. That will impact MNCs no matter where you are in the world, and they need to start thinking about some of that.
Well, on that sobering note, I want to move from geopolitics to macroeconomics. So a lot of discussion about potential recession, both from a U.S. and global perspective. Is that inevitable in 2023? We're recording this at the end of February, already seeing, I think, some signs of life. The labor market's a lot stronger. We're going to come back to labor scarcity. But just, as businesses start to plan for the rest of 2023, what do you see from a recessionary perspective?
So I have to caveat this answer, which you're not going to like because it's going to sound like a cop-out, but I have to. Right, I sort of play a macroeconomist on podcasts, but I'm not a real macroeconomist. But I work with really good macroeconomists, and here's what they think. Yeah. So if it's wrong, we can blame them. So I think there is a real possibility that the recession could be not as bad as feared, and there is a possibility that we could even avoid it. I don't know, honestly, if that is the best thing, because what is happening across sectors in a lot of places, at least in the US, is that companies are, it's going to be hard for me to do this in this chair, they're scrunching down, bracing for the impact of the recession. They're spending less, they're investing less, they're hiring less, they're freezing a lot of investments and operations. If the recession doesn't come, they are going to be very reticent to get up from that crouch because they're going to fear, well, it's going to come later, so I should just stay here in this foxhole. That in itself could bring on a recession. So if this doesn't happen, which in some ways, of course it would be negative, but it would be at least a pressure valve release, where at the far end of this, you could get back to growth. If it doesn't happen this year, in some ways, it might be one of the worst case scenarios because companies and their leadership, they're going to be reticent to give up this defensive posture. I think a lot of this, the Fed is trying to anticipate. Hats off to the Fed. I would not want to be on the Fed trying to manage all of this. But corporate America is trying to get ahead of this too, and they've made defensive moves for now, and I think that's what we're going to continue to see unless they know they're going to be in the storm.
And one of the things that we're seeing is a very tight labor market here in the U.S., and particularly labor scarcity. And I mean, frankly, it's a huge issue for tax accountants and tax lawyers, as we all know from dealing with Pillar 2 and some of the global changes that we're all dealing with. But what are some of the factors from a more macro perspective that are driving labor scarcity, and how is that impacting multinationals?
So this issue is one of those aftershocks from COVID. There is a significant portion of the U.S. workforce, particularly the white-collar workforce, but not exclusively, that dropped out during COVID, either because they could not afford, to keep going and paying for everything else they were doing, or they are caring for loved ones, be they 90 years old or 2 years old, and they can't afford to have anybody else do it for them, and they have not come back. And we're talking about something that is in the millions of people, right? It's not a small figure. You're also missing somewhere close to 1.5 million immigrants that ought to be in the U.S. economy that aren't in the US economy. And that's another contributing factor. The percentage of women in the workforce is slowly coming back, but if you look, and it's quite a depressing chart, at all the progress that was made from the 80s up until 2020, there was a period during COVID where it all got reversed because they bore the biggest brunt of the macroeconomic damage, and they were the ones who, by and large, sacrificed to go take care of their families and other families. They're coming back, but they're not back yet either. And so they're missing from the economy in the percentage that they ought to be too. Labor, like globalization, is a local story. And there are a lot of multinationals that are operating in places like India and Indonesia and Malaysia, where there's a huge demographic dividend. And there is plenty of labor to be had. And they are looking at those places much differently. But in the US, the labor market is, and this is not a technical term, cuckoo bananas. Like, it is off the rails trying to understand what has happened to labor through COVID and what is happening to it now. I would estimate that it is extraordinarily difficult to address this in economist graduate classes and business classes because it is changing every single day. This is one of those areas for businesses where the after effects from COVID are going to continue to play havoc with a lot of this for a while. And so a lot of this is going to come down to individual companies doing the best that they can. But it also links back to your last question about the recession, which is many of them can't do the things in terms of getting ahead on the labor curve because they're afraid that if they invest too much, they're going to have to cut back. So I think there's lots of dynamics yet to play out yet in terms of labor.
So let's turn to energy. Last year, we saw in the U.S. the Inflation Reduction Act, which really had less to do with inflation reduction and more about an unprecedented green energy bill with a number of credits and incentives to encourage green energy. There's obviously energy security concerns in Europe. And what does that mean for transition to renewables broadly, and how much and what should businesses be thinking about in that context?
So we talked briefly, or I talked about, that hypothetical corporate officer, right, who's walking down the hall and looking at the picture of all their predecessors. That corporate officer is not going to be the one in most cases who is going to be here in 2050 that's going to have to sign off on the 2050, net zero goal. But they are responsible for getting us there. The effort towards net zero and electricity and renewables is real. There is massive amounts of investment that is happening both in terms of the private and the public space on this. It's not to be underestimated. Part of the challenge here, though, is that it's going to be really difficult to do this without access to the Chinese market, right? The Chinese market controls many, as many people know, right? It controls many of the critical minerals and components that make that technology go. And to recreate that, if it could be done in the US alone, would take years and trillions of dollars of investment on top of what we've got already. So if we think about a future, 5, 10, 12 years in the future, where the US and China are really at economic odds with one another, and we can't have odds to their technology and their resources, it's going to slow the progress here. I suspect this is part of what is in the administration's mind when they think about keeping things on an even keel, which is that US businesses and US as a whole are going to continue to need access to this, right? And the US is scouring the earth. If any of you have a deposit of lithium in your backyard, I would raise that possibility to the federal government promptly, right? They're looking everywhere, that they can for these things, but there just isn't that much, and it takes a lot to get it out. So I think this is a real effort, but it's going to take a while. I think businesses are on board, but people should not forget about the geopolitical challenge side of the energy coin.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Maybe the last question for you. What are maybe one or two issues, either from a geopolitical, macroeconomic perspective, that multinationals should really be keeping an eye on over the course of 2023 and beyond?
So let's pick one of each. I think for the macroeconomic part of this, what I would really start to urge companies to do is to understand two things. One, as you think about your investor chain and your component chain, right? If you produce something, not just the finished product, but every component, does any of that come from a place that the US government might have a question about? And when it comes to the investor side, keep in mind that the US government pays a lot of attention looking at the chain of investors. And it's not just the chain of investors directly in the corporation, it's who's investing in those people. And if one of those people is traced back to somebody who should not be, in the eyes of the US government, investing in a US company, the US government's gonna figure it out. So companies need to be going the extra mile at a time when Washington is obsessed with national security and doing due diligence on their supply chain and their investors. I think geopolitically, it is preparing for really negative things to happen when it comes to Ukraine. Because if Russia can't win, and I don't know if they can, they may be forced to destroy the country. And that could lead to massive, movements of people and, the use of weapons that we haven't had to contemplate in a while. These are things that people don't like to talk about. It's why I never get invited back to dinner parties, which I perfectly understand. But we shouldn't put our head in the sand about these things either. And I think businesses need to think about what ifs. And we've just been through 40 months, right, where businesses, if they've been paying attention, should have learned a significant amount about agility. And they should have come to a realization about how do you anticipate these things. If they've been doing that, they should be ready no matter what comes. If they're not ready for that, I would urge them to start to think about some of the more negative what-if scenarios and what happens if they come to pass.
Well, Craig, you make international tax actually feel easy, given all the ground that you just covered and the knowledge you have. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with us. And I will tell you that all of our future podcasts should be in person. This is much better.
Totally agreed.
So thank you very much for coming to join. Can we give Craig a round of applause? So thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Craig Stonberg, Senior Director of PwC Intelligence. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Stay tuned in 2 weeks for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.